It's time to talk about another special keyword that the JavaScript engine sets up for you automatically when you execute a function. It's called arguments. And since in the next version of JavaScript, we probably won't use arguments as much, we'll mention the new approach to doing what arguments does currently, which was called spread. But if you're looking at any code, especially current code of frameworks and libraries, their source code, you're likely going to see the arguments variable. So you should know what it is and how to use it. As we've seen many times before, when you execute a function, a new execution context is created, and the JavaScript engine sets up some things for us, like a variable environment to hold our variables, an outer environment reference for the scope chain, the special keyword this, which will point to different things depending on where the function lives or how it's called. And it also sets up another special keyword called arguments. Arguments contains a list of all the values of all the parameters that you pass to a function. So arguments holds all those values that you pass to whatever function you're calling. And just to be really clear, big word alert, arguments, the concept of arguments in general is just another name for the parameters you pass to a function. So you could say your parameters, you could also say your arguments. That's really in the case of any programming language that has functions. However, JavaScript gives you a keyword of that same name, which contains them all. So when we're talking about the concept of arguments, we're just talking about the parameters you pass to your function. But the special keyword arguments is something special that the JavaScript engine sets up for you. To understand arguments and how it can be useful, let's set up another simple scenario. We've been using this idea of a greeting function a lot. So let's create a function greet, and it'll be first name, last name, and language. And then inside here, all I'm going to do for now is just log all of these parameters, all of these arguments that I've passed to my function. Let's do that. Okay. So if I call greet, then it's going to log these values. Now here's what's unusual about JavaScript compared to other languages. I can just call greet and not have any parameters passed to it. In other programming languages, this would be an error. It would say, well, I expect these values. But JavaScript doesn't care. If I go run this in my browser, and I'll refresh the page here, I get undefined. So hoisting, that thing that happens when the function is executed, where it sets up the values, takes care of these parameters for me, even though I haven't given them values. It executed the greet function, and the first thing it did was set up memory space for first name, last name, and language, and set them equal to undefined, just like we've already learned. And the fact that we didn't give it any values to set it to, well, JavaScript didn't care. It still set up the memory space, and they're equal to undefined, just like we've learned before. And then if I start to pass arguments, they'll be processed left to right. So if I pass John, it will assume that this one is the first name, and that I've passed nothing to the last name and language. So what I see, and just to make sure we separate clearly these different parameters, or these different function calls, I'm just going to put a line there so that we see that in the console log. So first we'll see this get outputted, then we'll see this get outputted. And when I run this, you'll see now that first name holds John, and the other two are still undefined because of hoisting. So I could go on, and I could pass dough, and then I could pass dough and EN for English, or ES for Spanish, or whatever. And we'll see that on each one of those subsequent function invocations, each time I run that function, first I have 3 undefined, then 2, then only language is undefined, and then they're all 3 are defined. So this means that you can skip the passing of parameters, or you can pass only part of this list of parameters, and JavaScript's okay with that. While this feels a little weird, it actually introduces some powerful concepts to the language under certain circumstances. For example, in the next version of JavaScript, I'll be able to set a default parameter. I'll be able to say, if you don't give me a value, then make it English, for example, here. If I don't give you language, if this is undefined in these first 3 cases here, then set this value. However, as that's not available in all modern browsers yet, and older ones as well, you can use that default parameter concept, the default value concept, to set up default parameters. So I could say language is equal to language or English. So if this is undefined, it gets passed to the OR operator, gets coerced to false, because undefined coerces to false, remember? And then I'll end up with this value, English, getting passed to the equals operator, so language will end up equaling English if it's undefined by the time I start running this statement. All right, let's try that. Refresh. Notice now instead of undefined for language, I get English, 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 and then when I do pass it, it just stays Spanish. See that? So I've set up default parameters using this approach. In the next version of JavaScript, I'll be able to just put it right there where I declare the parameter while defining the function. And at this point, we can also show you that there's a special keyword that the JavaScript engine has set up for us. Just like the keyword this, we have a new keyword called arguments. Notice I didn't declare it anywhere. It's just automatically available to me. The execution context made sure that I have this set up. So what do I get when I see arguments? Let's look. Well, notice that it's containing a list of all the values of the parameters that I've passed. See that? So you might notice that this kind of looks like an array, but we generally declare an array with brackets like that. Those are slightly italicized brackets. That's because the arguments special thing that the JavaScript engine sets up is what we'd call array-like. You'll see that if you look it up. That means that it acts like an array, it looks like an array, but it isn't exactly a JavaScript array. Only in the sense that it doesn't have all the features of a JavaScript array. A lot of people are upset about this too. They think that's wrong. I agree. I think arguments should just be a regular JavaScript array, but that's what the engine does. It's suffice it to say that it acts enough like an array that we can use it in the same way under most circumstances. So for example, if I don't want my function to try to do anything if no parameters are passed, I could check the arguments.length. And if it's 0, meaning that since it contains the list of all the values, a length of 0, just like any array would mean it's empty, I could do something like missing parameters. And then I'll just drop this and return. And the return statement will just kick me back out of the function and it won't do any of this. So if I save and run this, look at that, missing parameters. And then it goes on when I finally have some parameters, because this arguments variable .length is greater than 0. That is, it isn't 0, it just skips this if and moves on. So I could do something special depending on how many arguments was passed to me, for example. And although arguments doesn't contain the names of the arguments, just the values, I could use it like an array. I can use the brackets operator and say, give me an argument value at that position, so the 0 position, being the first position, and I should see that there. And just to be clear what it is, I'll just say arg0 like that. And if I go back and refresh, we see that arg0 is John, because it's the first element in this array-like structure called arguments. So that's arguments. When you see this being used, you can understand what it is. It's worth saying that as time goes on, arguments will become what's called deprecated. That means that it's something that will still be around, but won't be the best way to do something anymore. There'll be something new. The new thing is called a spread parameter. That means that if I have parameters that I'm passing to a function, I can add a parameter with a dot, 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 and then a name, whatever that name might be that I want to call it. And if I tack on other parameters in the call, let's say I added on an address and a street name and a city name or something like that, these extra parameters that aren't defined explicitly all get wrapped up into a JavaScript array. So this dot, dot, dot means take everything else and wrap it up into an array of this name. This isn't completely available yet either, but once it becomes available, then it will be the preferred approach to dealing with various sequences and various numbers of arguments, of parameters. So that's just good to know about. But again, right now, you'll see a lot of usage of arguments.